Well, howdy, buckos. Ready for the new Peasant Cube update from JankDivers for Outlaws of Thunder Junction? Yeah! Let's get it on. Let's jump into white. So first up, we're replacing Banishing Light with Getaway Glamour. Banishing Light is the definition of filler, and it's never a card that people want to put in their main deck. Occasionally, it'll be the 23rd card in your deck, or you'll sideboard it in because your opponent has a must-answer threat. But we tend not to like cards that are so low on the priority list. We want cards to at least have some amount of value somewhere, especially as the overall card quality increases. Getaway Glamour looks to be a pretty interesting card, especially for our blue-white deck. Being able to blink one of your creatures relatively cheaply while also being stapled to a removal spell is a pretty nice starting point. And if you get the full 4 mana worth of value off of this card, where you blink a value creature and then also destroy an opponent creature, it will be quite powerful. You can also use this to remove 2 of your opponent's blockers for a turn. And so it has a little bit of flexibility in the applications that it could be used. This seems like the kind of card that we like to put in our cube, especially given how board-centric it is. This does have some hoops you have to jump through. If you have the biggest creature, obviously it doesn't work unless you also exile your creature until end of turn. So some of the cards that go a little tall might not play super well with this. We're going to try swapping Conclave Tribunal for Lassoed by the Law. Conclave Tribunal is a card that we haven't really been super excited about for a while. This is a card that is ultimately fine, and sometimes you pay a single mana for this and you convoke some creatures that couldn't attack, and then it feels really, really good. Most of the time now, though, when we use our removal spells, we want to be able to set up attacks in the decks that would be able to convoke. Lassoed by the Law doesn't necessarily help with that the turn you play it. It is a more expensive card on average than Conclave Tribunal since you can't reduce the cost. That being said, because it makes a 1/1 and the Mercenary token will help push damage on future turns, this card has more ability to act like a Banisher Priest type effect and to help us push damage. So we're going to give this one a shot. We're a little uncertain whether the 1/1 token is going to make a big deal or not, but I expect Mercenary tokens to more than pull their weight. If that's not the case, then I'm sure we'll get another variant or 2 of this kind of effect in the next set. Next up, we have Selfless Savior coming out for Nurturing Pixie. If you watched our set review, you know I'm extremely excited for this card as a 1 mana Chorus Skyfisher variant. I feel like this effect is just absolutely priced to move. It's been a while since Selfless Savior was a top dog in the cube. Since we cut a Biting Grace a ways back, it hasn't really had the same kind of impact. And honestly, the way the Peasant Cube works, there aren't enough cards in white that it's truly necessary to protect. Sure, there's Neighborhood Guardian and Rosy Cotton that are extremely powerful enablers, but the cost of putting a 1 mana 1/1 with no other effect into your deck is a real cost compared to something like Dauntless Bodyguard that's at least able to attack for 2. We're going to go ahead and slot in the Pixie. It was kind of just a matter of what did we think the worst white 1-drop was, and this is where we leave. Next up, in what seems to be a sweeping change of removal spells, Dusk Rose Reliquary is coming out for Journey to Nowhere. Journey is a pretty historically powerful card. It sees play in Legacy Pauper decks, and when it was in Standard, it was a mainstay of that format. 2 mana is where we want. And while we do have Ossification, this is definitely going to serve as kind of an Ossification number 2. And it's even more flexible given that you don't have to have a basic land. So this is something that your multicolor piles can more effectively use since Ossification does have that casting cost. Dusk Rose Reliquary has been pretty good, but the cost of sacrificing a thing is real given that none of our white decks are sack decks. Oftentimes you can get away with just sacking a 1/1 token, but you really don't like giving up board presence, even for the efficiency of this card. Rafine's Informant is coming out for Sheriff of Safe Passage. The Informant was a bit of a hand smoother type card that we're not sure if white needs. We'll come back to this one if it feels like something that that color would really like. The Sheriff we deemed as a 2-drop because we think most of the time you're going to plot this on 2 and cast it sometime between turn 3 and 5. Once you can cast it as a keyword big creature of 4 power and toughness or greater, which would require 3 other creatures. It's possible to do this as early as turn 3 with a 1-drop as well as, say, a Clarion Spirit plus this on turn 3 would allow you to do that. There's other ways as well, but the longer you can wait on a card like this, the better it's going to be. It could be that this just ends up being a little too slow and clunky, but we wanted to at least give it a shot. Plot is a really cool mechanic to enable double spells and combo turns, and we haven't had a lot of that at Peasant, so I think it's one of the more exciting mechanics that we've had in a little while. As a final swap, this is not a card that was in the set, but we're going to go ahead and swap Spirited Companion for Ambitious Farmhand. We find most of the time when you're casting Spirited Companion in the early game, you're really just looking for a land anyways, and the Farmhand has a more interesting gameplay aspect of being able to flip into the 3/3 lifelinker later into the game, giving it a little more reach as an actual creature. And with that, we'll move on into blue. First up, we are cutting Blur for Phantom Interference. Blur was added as a flex slot in the first place, and it really hasn't seen any play. We think Phantom Interference might be the best blue common in the set, being a bit of a flash Windrake / quench modal card that later into the game kind of ends up being a 5-mana 2/2 flash flyer that also quenches your opponent. I don't think the flyer mode on this card is particularly efficient, and most of the time in the early to mid game, this is just going to be quench. That being said, the scaling on this card is real. It's one of the advantages of Spree. So Zarek Strobe Knight is being replaced with Slick Shot Lockpicker. The Strobe Knight was honestly one of the more disappointing cards that we've added to the cube. This card seemed like the type of card that would be really sick and could take over a game, but most of the time blue decks just aren't casting 2 spells on their own turn. It's not often that comes up in our blue sections. And so oftentimes this just ends up being a Windrake with Vigilance, and Windrakes are bad. That being said, new exciting card. We have Snapcaster Mage at Peasant. Obviously this card's worse than Snapcaster Mage, costs more mana, as well as not having flash. Means you can never flash back a counterspell with this card. I don't think any of that matters. I think this card is probably going to be very, very powerful. Sometimes you'll plot it to set up future turns because you don't have spells in your graveyard, which is an upside over Snapcaster Mage. Just being able to spend the mana in advance on this card will come up. This card is going to have a lot of cool turns that it can enable. And funny enough, it would have been a good card to have with the Strobe Knight. In any case, Slickshot Lockpicker is a really cool and exciting card. We're really glad to have it. It's one of the cards I was most excited about actually playing out of the set. Okay. So Mirror Shell Crab is coming out for This Town Ain't Big Enough. And while it's entirely possible that this card ain't good enough, we're interested in trying it. I'm not sure if we've had a double bounce at instant speed at Peasant yet. It's a pretty powerful effect for tempo reasons. And the ability to also flex as a Aether Trade Wind style card is definitely interesting. There's also some other niche things that this card does. So for example, it's a card you can cast for 2 mana that triggers up the Beanstalk and will let you rebuy a lot of various cards. I think the flexibility on this card is hopefully going to be enough to carry it over the finish line. Mirror Shell Crab is a card that we've been kind of looking to cut for a while. It's not been particularly good. It's a bad counter spell and not great as a creature. What's the best way to put this? Yes, thank you, Pinchy. It is true that monstrous size does indeed have no intrinsic merit. The crab being keyword big isn't enough for it to be good, and even though sometimes you get to reanimate this on turn 4 or 5, it's not consistent enough. Card's just, unfortunately, a bit underwhelming. While some crabs in this cube are never getting replaced, this is not one of them. Silent Departure is coming out for Repulse. Departure's been a card that I don't think people have been particularly interested in casting for quite a while. Sorcery Speed really takes away a lot of the bite that bounce spells tend to have, being able to protect your creature and be more flexible. It ends up being basically only a tempo card. Repulse is a card that they actually didn't print for quite a while because of how messed up this card can be in Limited. While it may not seem like the most powerful effect, Into the Royal and Blink of an Eye type effects tend to be some of the most powerful cards we have available. And even when they printed a card like this at Sorcery in Tolarian Geyser, it was still one of the best blue commons. Repulse at instant speed is just a very, very powerful card, and I'm interested to see how it holds up in Modern Magic. The draw card floor on this card just means that you're going to be able to fire this off pretty aggressively, which is something a lot of these cards don't have. Bounce spells tend to be cards that reward you for finding your moment, but Repulse is a card that if I've got it in my hand and not much else to do, I think I'm going to be happy to just snap off on turn 3 some percentage of the time. Skyclave Aerialist is coming out for Visage Bandit. The Aerialist is a good card without a good home in our current iteration of the cube. What it's offering is just not something that most of our blue decks are super interested in. The Visage Bandit is a card that I'm really ready to be disappointed in if it doesn't work out. The plot on this card is one of the bigger plots of any of the cards that they put it on, partly because this bypasses one of the main weaknesses of this style of card. So the way that these sort of clone effects typically work is that because they only target your creatures, you have to already have untapped with a good creature, and so they end up feeling very win more. The Bandit, on the other hand, is going to feel much more combo-y, where now you're playing your powerful creature and then immediately copying it, as opposed to needing to untap with it. And I think that timing difference is going to be a really big deal. Your opponent obviously will know that you have this and can hold up removal, but if your opponent just wants to hold up removal the whole game, you aren't obligated to play into it. I think this is the kind of card that if this effect isn't good, is probably one they should just abandon. I have high hopes for this one, but it is a speculative addition to the cube, so we'll see. Our final swap is another one of these cleanup swaps that has nothing to do with the current set. I mentioned before that a lot of our 2s were replaceable, and Fairy Vandal in particular feels quite bad. None of our blue decks are remotely interested in this. It doesn't even offer the flip for value that Skyclave Aerialist offers. So we're going to try bringing in Philology Archaeologist and see how that works. This is the kind of card that can be a decent speed bump for our slower control your decks. And a lot of our decks have gotten more interested in putting more cards into the graveyard. We don't know if this card's going to be good enough, but it's impressed in some other cubes that we've seen it in. So we're going to go ahead and give it a shot and see if it fits our blue section better. All right, that wraps up blue. We got more than one card this time, guys. Okay, so that takes us to black. Our first change in black is going to be Ichor Drinker coming out for Forsaken Miner. The Drinker was a relatively recent add as just a flexible card that was something cheap to do that then provides a little bit of extra value. The Miner, however, is one of the best versions of this particular kind of effect we've seen, having a second point of toughness and being able to be used multiple times per turn for only a single mana potentially. Miner is probably less attractive in something like green-black that is a slower, grindier deck, but it will be very strong, we think, in Rakdos and possibly black-white as well. Both of those decks tend to be reasonable at committing crimes and kind of like the aggressive stat line here. This looks to be one of the best versions of this effect we've seen, so we're pretty excited to have it at Peasant. First Fear Gargantua is getting replaced with Hollow Marauder. The Gargantua has been a filler level card for a while. It is a card that you could conceivably get into your graveyard and then get a little bit of value and a good attack with the Unearth trigger. But honestly, it gets cut more often than it sees play. The Hollow Marauder reminds me a little bit of a card we played for a while called Necromass from DMU, except this card is better in functionally every way. Being a 4-power flyer is a real clock, and the amount of value that this card can represent is quite high. When your opponent discards a card, they have to discard a 4-mana or greater card, which will be something relevant, and many of our Peasant Cube decks don't play more than a handful of cards like that. This card's going to very frequently for your value-oriented decks be just an absolute beating, especially if you get around to recurring it or blinking it or anything like that. Even on its front, we suspect if you're paying 4 mana for this, you're happy with it. And if you get down to 1 or 2 mana, it's going to be an absolute steal. Ransack the Lab's coming out for Lively Dirge. The Ransack never feels good to play. This sort of effect really wants to be on a creature, something like an Organ Hoarder. We're going to swap it out for Lively Dirge. We feel like we're sort of getting to the point where this effect might be overrepresented in the cube, especially once we get into the gold section and I show you some more cards that we have that do this sort of graveyard recursion thing. But these effects are popular and play relatively powerfully. I'd expect some number of them to be cut down the road when we have to actually start competing more for card slot. These peasant sets, as of recent, are becoming exceptionally powerful. The Dirge should be very good for us, though. Even if I ignore the mode that allows us to entomb a creature, being able to pay 4 mana to return 1 and a 3 or 2/2s to the battlefield is a pretty reasonable rate. And the fact that if I draw this later into the game, I'm going to be able to tutor up my best card to go with whatever's already in my graveyard is pretty neat. Some popular combinations of these cards will probably look something along the lines of Archfiend's Vessel plus a 3-drop. Which is probably the most powerful thing you can do. And honestly, Archfiend's Vessel being able to be tutored up to put into your graveyard for this could be a legitimately powerful feature of the card. I'm pretty excited for this one to see if the spree ends up mattering or if this is most of the time just 4 mana for a slightly more expensive version of Call the Death Dweller. Ravenous Squirrel's coming out for Nezumi Link Breaker. The Squirrel has been a decent card in this cube at various points. The problem is it has some of the same color identity issues that another card we're going to talk about later has, in that this is very firmly a black card, not a black or green card. You're never going to put this into a base green deck. You're going to put this into black decks, so it's been in our black section. The Link Breaker is just a cleaner text line, and while it's not a payoff, I think that this is one of the more exciting versions of this effect. We've all kind of honed in that mercenary tokens we expect to be substantial upgrades over a regular 1/1 token. Ratatouille 3 is coming out for Rictus Robber. I was really excited when Lord Skitter's Butcher was announced. It looked like the best version of this effect that we had seen. In practice, it ended up not actually being all that good, unfortunately. While I still love the design and it makes me smile, this card has some issues. The rat not being able to block is a huge downside. A rat token is just not worth as much as a regular token, much in the way that I think a mercenary token will be worth more. Not being able to block is a huge dent. If this card made just a regular 1/1 token, it would be much better. I don't know how often I've seen people use the actual sack effect. It's very often that they have other sack engines and they're really playing this as a card to make a token. The third mode did come up from time to time to enable some aggressive attacks, but the rat itself doesn't actually contribute all that much to your board, so you're paying quite a premium for that effect. Rictus Robber looks like just an incredible card. It does require you to either have a removal spell, force a trade, or have a sack outlet. But if you can meet one of those conditions, then this card is going to be an exceptional amount of value. Even when you pay 4 mana for this, you get 6/5 worth of stats. And if you pay 3 for this, that 6/5 worth of stats is going to be insane. I've pegged Rictus Robber as one of the cards that I think is very, very powerful on this set. I'm really excited to see if it pans out. We're also making a swap of Lamp Pad of Death's Vigil for Vermingorger. This isn't necessarily that we think one is better than the other, per se. We've ran the Lamp Pad for an extremely long time, and in a recent cube, we had Vermingorger be exceptionally impressive, and we just want to give it a shot. The being able to be a free sack outlet that also attacks for 2 makes it a slightly more aggressively slanted card and less combo-y. The Lamp Pad encourages a very passive playstyle until we get to a point where we can just sack a bunch of stuff in one turn and drain them out. I think the Vermingorger is going to be a average use case good card that will probably feel less bad to lose to than the Lamp Pad, since oftentimes when the Lamp Pad came down in the mid to late game, you just instantly lost because of the way the Blood Artist stacking works. That takes care of black, and we're going to be moving on into red. First up, we're going to swap Blazing Rootwalla for Reckless Lackey. The Rootwalla was part of a 2-card Madness package with Fiery Temper that we added a ways back. And while Fiery Temper has seen consistent play and has been excellent, the Rootwalla just never really got there. It turns out having to pay to have this be more than a 1/1 is not particularly good, and you really want to cast this card on turn 1. By the time you could Madness it out, it very frequently just didn't do anything relevant. Comparatively to Fiery Temper, which has a fail case that's just a slightly inefficient burn spell and a positive case of being completely insane. We think Reckless Lackey will just be a good quality 1-drop. If you are able to put a Bone Splitter or some +1 counters on it, it does have First Strike, which will be extremely annoying to deal with. And if it just sort of sits around and becomes invalidated later into the game, you do have this option to sack it and to make a treasure token, which can help you find some burn to close the game out. Giant Cindermaw is coming out for Scalestorm Summoner. The Cindermaw awkwardly is a card that could trigger this, but it's kind of a feels bad card. It doesn't really have any particular synergies. It was just a big, dumb beater that also acted as a bit of a hate piece against some of our life gain. The Summoner, on the other hand, looks to be just awesome. I don't really know what they're doing with this card because it feels like this would have been a rare in some sets. Because this card doesn't say another card, if you ever put a +1 counter on it or get it any bigger, it's going to be able to start triggering itself, which is a very, very silly card, on top of having just decent enough stats. The vanilla test is dead when it comes to the main JankDiver Cube, but here at Peasant, a 3/3 for 3 is still a passable stat line. We're going to try swapping Twisted Fealty for Take for a Ride. The Fealty is an incredible finisher for aggressive decks, being able to put so much damage out because of the Wicked Roll token. We think Take for a Ride will be worse in that regard. We kind of like the flexibility and the implications of being able to play this in slightly slower decks to blow out on combat. It's possible that the way that Twisted Fealty just is so specifically good in its role will end up being superior. We don't get these sort of Ray of Command threaten effects basically ever anymore, so we wanted to give this one a shot since it is unique. We'll take Visionaries coming out for Cunning Coyote. The Visionary is a fine enough card. There's nothing particularly wrong with it, but you don't often activate the tap ability with it. It very frequently just attacks as a 3/1 until it dies. If it does get you some value and turn into a 4/3, it can be good, but it's very slow for an aggressive card. The Coyote, on the other hand, is going to enable some pretty explosive turns. Being able to plot this on 2 and then play, say, Scalestorm Summoner on turn 3 to give it +1/+1 in haste to make a 3/1. There's a lot of other things I think you're going to be able to do with this card that will be powerful and exciting. It was a card we were definitely interested in testing. And finally, we've got a swap of Electrostatic Infantry for Person of Interest. The Infantry is functionally a blue-red gold card, and it's one of the bigger payoffs. We find it a little unreasonable how often this 2-drop ends up being something like a 5/6 Trampler. It just isn't something that other decks can replicate. The only deck that ever wants this is blue-red, which is one of our top-performing decks. We're going to replace this with Person of Interest, which we think is a more flexible card. Our Boros go-wide decks, as well as our black-red sack decks, will probably love this card. And I could see it seeing play in Gruul, or even Izzet as well, even though it doesn't have any sort of spells payoff. I suspect Izzet has better things to be doing, but we just learned that you don't need to have that many payoffs for Izzet because casting a bunch of spells is fairly intrinsically powerful, and there's so many prowess adjacent creatures. Okay, so that takes us to green. First up in green, Duskwatch Recruiters coming out for Aloe Alchemist. The Recruiter used to be a card that I would have been very excited to open, and it's really fallen off fairly quickly given the power level of the last year or so. The mana sink effect is just relatively weak, and green value decks have much better ways of continuing to get value, and even the aggressive decks can find other ways or just be better on curve. Being a 2/2 in current year is a bit of a cost unless your upside is incredible, which this one's is good, but I don't know if we would say incredible. The Aloe Alchemist will just be a 3/2 Trampler most of the time when you play it on turn 2, which is pretty good. But if you draw it later into the game, plotting this to be able to pump a thing will push a ton of damage. So this card maintains some relevance later into the game. It's not quite a combat trick, but it is an effect that can be used to push damage, sort of combat trick adjacent. And what should be a fairly easy swap, we're going to trade Eccentric Farmer for Patient Naturalist. The Naturalist does have to hit from lands that you milled, so unlike the Farmer, can't pick up things that you've previously put into the graveyard, which could come up, but the being able to get a treasure token when you whiff should make this card better in the average circumstance. Again, there are narrow spots where the Naturalist will be worse, but in most cases, I think it'll be better. Brambleworm's trading out for Spinewood's Armadillo. Brambleworm was a card that we added in the last update, again, just to kind of give a little extra support to our green-black deck, but they just really don't need that much. Most of the effects that they're looking for seem to be the repeatable sources, so things like Armored Scrap Gorger. There's not too many of those, but there's enough ways to trigger this that if you're looking for them and prioritizing them appropriately, you should be able to get them. The Armadillo is fairly ridiculous. Why is this thing 6 mana? It's so flexible because of its early game utility of getting a land and gaining some life, which should give you time to get later to the game. And then it's just a big, dumb creature. Now, having trample will come up as it does for all giant green creatures without trample, but this should still be a giant, fairly efficient creature. We're pretty excited to try that out. Mass Vandal's coming out for Stubborn Burrow Feed. The Vandal was a card we were testing that nobody really seems to want to play, and the Burrow Fiend looks pretty exciting. It is a card that will give us a repeatable mill engine that will also be just a powerful finisher later in the game, kind of doing an Akawali impression. Not a lot to say here. We were kind of waiting for something that was interesting to try in this slot, and here we are. Elven Farsight is getting swapped for Trash the Town. The Farsight is a card that everyone knows I like, though at Peasant, I actually like this card less than in our more powerful environment, where I felt like the scrying 3 and digging for your most powerful creature is a lot better when the card you're digging for is something like Titan of Industry that's going to win you the game. Here, Farsight is fine, but nobody plays this card even if I advocate for it. And we think Trash the Town is probably better anyways. 2 mana to be able to get a divination out of your combat will be really powerful. And this card has 2 other modes on top of that to give it a good bit of flexibility and raw power. We're pretty excited to test this card given that we put it into both of our cubes. I'm sure this is going to be a contentious one, but Contagious Vorak is swapping out for Rambling Possum. The Vorak has strong Chains of Mephistopheles energy, and that about half the text on this card has nothing to do with the 99% use case of it of getting a land. All of the text on it that involves proliferating with a reminder text is just irrelevant most of the time. The Possum is an effect that we haven't had on the client. It kind of has strong Teamer Sabertooth vibes in that it could enable some sort of silly combo. Obviously, the Sabertooth had the sort of repeatable use on a single turn that could be very, very silly, and had the indestructible claws that would make it obnoxious to deal with. But the Possum has a pretty good rate. It attacks reasonably large, and it will, again, give some more of these sort of Sky Fishery variants in a different color. I'm going to leave it to our players to decide if the things that this is offering are good enough, but it's a pretty nifty card, so we decided to try it. Mother Bear swapping out for Beastbond Outcaster. I really want Mother Bear to be a good card, and unfortunately it's not. Paying 5 mana to get 2 2/2s out of your graveyard sounds awesome until you ever have to actually click the button. Only being at a sorcery speed and taking away from casting mana for your other more powerful cards just comes up a ton. You rarely ever end up getting to actually flash this back. The Beastbonder Outcaster, we expect, plot this on 2, you'll play it on 3, and it'll essentially be a 2 mana 3/3 that you had to wait a turn for. We suspect some percentage of the time you'll get to draw a card, probably not on turn 3, but if you draw this later into the game, you'll very frequently get to draw a card with this, which makes it a great value card. That takes us into our multicolor section. And first up, we have Gingerbread Hunter out for Badlands Revival. We had originally slated this to be Insidious Roots, but we got some feedback from our players that they've really enjoyed having access to the card, and they think it's really fun as a build around. The Hunter is a great overall package, but isn't really doing anything specific for our decks. So we decided to go ahead and swap it out for Badlands Revival, which is a card that looks to be like a good amount of value. This card, first off, will trigger your Insidious Roots or Chalk Outline 2 times, and it will give you an immediate 5 mana reanimate with a follow-up play for the next turn. I sort of wonder what the ceiling is on this sort of card, and I did mention earlier that we are running a little high on the number of these kind of effects that we're running, but this card's sick. And the even more interesting of the 2 green, black, gold cards, we're going to bring in Honest Rutstein to replace Akawali the Seething Tower. Akawali actually was a pretty popular card. People really liked having this like Tarmogoyfi 3 mana 5/5 trample type card, but Rutstein is just such a good value card. And at the end of the day, the Golgari deck is almost always a late game value deck. It is a game that is trying to big fish everything. Early into the game, if you have to play this on turn 3, it's still a threatening card because with nothing in your graveyard, you're still getting this cost reduction effect that has been historically powerful. Anytime you get the full package here and you're able to take advantage of both the static effect as well as the trigger, you're going to feel like you got away with something. And on top of that, look how cool he looks. We're super excited to have Rutstein here in Peasant. I really wish we could get a uncommon version of old Rutstein. Just saying. Shrouded Shepherd's going to be replaced with Ruthless Lawbringer. Shrouded Shepherd is a pretty solid card and an overall good package. The problem with this card is that you're most of the time just playing this as a white bear that pumps one of your dudes until the end of turn, and sometimes the Cleave Shadows effect will come up. This just isn't really on plan with what our black-white deck is doing. I wouldn't be opposed to playing this card as a white 2-mana card, though the quality of that slot has gone up as well. The thing is Ruthless Lawbringer sort of falsely signals a sacrifice theme. Really, the reason we're interested in playing this is oftentimes the black-white deck gets roadblocked in the mid game by just people playing more expensive cards, bigger cards, and this will give you a way to push past those. A lot of times you'll have an extra token or a sackable creature floating around. And on top of that, this is a card we can bring back with our Unearths, our Helping Hands, our Lively Dirges, things like that, to be able to add immediately to the board and blow something up, which is something the other Necrotal style cards can't do. In another small, or not so small perhaps, hit to Izzet, we're going to swap Gandalf's Sanction for Slick Sequence. I want to preface by saying I think Slick Sequence is awesome, so it's possible this card isn't actually a particularly big downgrade. I would expect when you look at the 17 lands data to just be one of those cards that's completely ridiculous. But the Sanctions was a pretty big deal because what ends up happening is Izzet very frequently ends up being this aggressive deck, and it will start off with a powerful proactive draw. And it'll cycle through a lot of cards finding Gandalf Sanction, and then about the time you stabilize, they will sanction and dome you for 8 damage. And it just kills you from such a high life total when the deck already tends to have such a strong early game that this card just feels really unreasonable. And even if it's not overpowered, it feels particularly miserable to lose to. So we're going to go ahead and swap it. Slick Sequence should be awesome. I'm assuming this card is just going to still be a fantastic spell for this deck. All right, last couple of swaps here. We're going to trade out a couple of dorky colorless creatures for lands. When we added the Scampering Surveyor, we had added a cave package to the cube. And since then, we had cut that package, and the Surveyor doesn't see a ton of play. We don't really feel like it's particularly necessary, and we wanted to be able to slot in Prismatic Vista. We went ahead and tried out the fetch lands, and they ended up being too good. We sort of like that Vista is one that we can just add one of, and while it will always fix your mana for one color of your choice, it's not going to go fetch shock lands, and it's just not going to be quite as obscene as fetch lands while still being a pretty great land to prioritize early in a draft. And then we have Monoskellion coming out for Arid Archway. The Monoskellion is a card I am personally a fan of, but doesn't really see all that much play. And even I'll acknowledge it's not super powerful. It has mostly sideboard implications, especially since we cut the counters deck from our cube where you could stack this up and start machine gunning things down. The Archway is a deceptively powerful card. If you haven't played with these Karoo lands before, they are sort of card advantage in that because it taps for 2 mana and returns a land, if you open up with 2 lands and an Archway, you actually have 4 mana sources in your hand. And this has historically been pretty powerful. You're not going to be able to use the desert text on this card ever. We still think just being this sort of Karoo land, Guildless Plaza type card will just be good, especially since we don't have the actual Ravnica Karoo lands, which tapped for guild colors. We haven't seen this sort of effect on Arena, so we are kind of obligated to give it a shot. Again, I expect this card to be pretty good, though Modern Magic is quite fast, so it's possible the tempo loss is a big hit, especially if you're playing a number of tap lands. Because the set was so exceptionally powerful, I want to take a minute to just show some of the cards that we discussed and considered using, but ultimately decided not to run. There's a few here that, depending on how they perform, it wouldn't be unsurprising to see in the next set update. Some of them just don't fit where our cube's at right now, and some of them just didn't quite seem to fit our themes. But I do think this set was so powerful that all of these cards could very easily find their way into Peasant Cubes, and I wouldn't really blink. Okay, so real quick, up on your screen, I'm going to throw a changelog up. This just has all of the changes that we made in case you didn't want to sit through the entire video again and just wanted to take a look at what we made swaps for. All right, so thank you for joining me. Up on the screen, I've posted our JankDiverGaming schedule. Remember, the best way to support JankDiverGaming is to come join our Discord, hang out, maybe play some Cube. We also have the new Brawlbarians League. I actually took home week 2, and if you want to see on my channel, you can watch the slow, monotonous gameplay of 2 people drawing lands and then playing them. This week should be much more exciting. We're all playing tiny leaders and all uncommons, so that'll be a fun one. We're pretty excited by this one. It's gotten a lot of positive feedback from people, excited to put their brewer hat on and give it a shot. In any case, for our Cube, Wednesday and Sunday evenings at 7:30 EST, we play our JankDiverGaming Cube, which used to be called the Unrestricted Cube. On Fridays at 7:30, we have a community-voted F&M Cube, in which each week you're given 3 choices of different cube options that we have, and players vote and play on them. Saturday and Sunday at 2:30, we run alternative cubes, frequently featuring cubes from members of our community, a few of which end up on a semi-regular schedule because people really like them. And then finally, Saturday at 7:30 EST, we have this here Peasant Cube that you just watched an update video for. So remember, you can come join the JankDiverGaming Discord to come play these. You can find more content over at youtube.com/@JankDiverGaming, which I'm assuming you're looking at right now, given that that's usually where these videos go up. You can find me, Teld, talking at twitch.tv/Teld Talks. I like to stream all of our cubes when I can. And sometimes I'll stream Retail Limited, and I'm considering streaming some other games from time to time. I have quite a bit of a backlog. Finally, you can find me hanging out with the boys, Tim and Chris, over at the Jank Tank, which can be found on Libsyn, as well as our YouTube channel and Spotify. Thanks again for joining me. Now go out there and form a posse, round up some bad guys, and leave the deputy alone, okay? He's had enough.